for having me. Good morning, everybody. So my presentation is obviously on the controlled Watchdog, a new index for measuring media freedom in Trinidad and Tobago. I'm from Trinidad and Tobago, and this work is based on my thesis for my PhD. And initially in that thesis, I was looking at journalism, culture, and media law in Trinidad and Tobago because we have had several media laws which threaten media freedom. And when we're talking about media freedom, I just wanted to take it back to look at what media freedom means in different countries and how it's measured. For example, one of the things that in Trinidad and Tobago, this is a quote from one of our journalists who's been around for decades, and he says, in our case, journalists are rarely kidnapped, injured, or killed in the Caribbean, but many of their stories die. Stories are killed by the chilling effect of draconian legal sanctions and by small, closed communities, advertisers, and publishers who either do not wish to offend or are concerned about the protection of people and interests with which they are associated. So just to give a bit of a backdrop, we do not have any public media in Trinidad and Tobago, and many countries in the Caribbean, most of them don't have public media. Most of the media entities are privately owned and or state-owned. Also, our populations range from 50,000 in the smaller islands. The 6 biggest islands have just over a million. And then the rest are, anywhere from 800,000 to 300,000 to 50,000. So we are really tiny communities. A lot of the times what happens in these communities, everyone knows everyone. Also, you may be covering your cousin or your aunt or your family member in the government or in a business. And the kind of monopoly that the companies have over the media space as well, the private entities, they also control a lot of how journalists cover things. So in terms of the study, I wanted to point out when we're talking about media freedom and looking at threats to media freedom, it's important to look at the westernized way that media rankings are done, and then also just give a nod to the global south and how all situations in all countries are different and not one size fits all. So, for example, in the RSF ranking, Trinidad is ranked as 44 currently, but my perspective is that because our media freedom circumstances, our environment is really different to a lot of other places. Our media freedom is actually way worse than a ranking of 44 would indicate. And so this research, it was also compared to other models, and it was also done in the perspective of looking at it with our history of deregulation of media, looking at it with US and UK influence, and also with the political relationships that journalists have with the government. And all of this has to be taken into account environmentally when looking at media freedom. It's not just, the fact that there are media laws that are harmful, but rather even in how journalists sort of like frame their stories, looking at even in the genesis of their ideas, if they feel that they can't actually have an idea and pursue it to fruition to cover a story, innately their media freedom is compromised even before they put the idea to paper or go into that editor's meeting to have that sort of say, let's cover this. So my argument is just that a new index for, or a more nuanced index for the Caribbean region especially needs to be looked at. In terms of this research as well, the Caribbean region is not covered. My PhD thesis was at the time, I think it still might be the first PhD in journalism in the Caribbean region. So there is a lot, the research ground is rich, and there's a lot to investigate in terms of media freedom and journalism culture as well. This is just one example of this is an example of the laws that there are. So for example, libel and defamation, you can go, there's jail time of 2 years. The fine is as the court directs, and then between a person and a corporate body. However, if you look at something like the Interception of Communication Act, you can have 7 years and up to 1 million TT in terms of a fine for a person, which is absolutely ridiculous. A lot of our media houses are, again, very small because we are a small island. We are 1.3 million people. So, if the media house is found guilty of any of these, or a journalist, the media house would be strangled and go under. So these laws serve as threats, all the time, and they have not been removed. There have been multiple moves for repealing these laws, but they're still on the books, and they're still there as a threat. Similarly, the role of advertisers as well. Just going back to this, the role of advertisers as well is important because, as I said, the media houses are owned by private entities, so advertisers obviously pay the journalistic salaries, which happens all around the world. But in a situation where, excuse me, the media laws like this, and especially with the type of private media, a journalist would not cover a story because the advertiser in the small country is most likely part of the business that owns the media house. So there is also a self-censorship that goes with just existing and working for that entity, that you cannot write anything against any company that entity owns, and most likely because of the size of the country, that is most things. So it's a serious problem in terms of what journalists can cover. Just a bit of a theoretical background. Just looking at rule to conceptualize the index and the framework, I looked at the Bordeaux's field theory because it's, again, the index is not something that can be in one way it must be static, but in another you must realize the interplays between different media houses and different officials, because each media house is owned by a different company. Some are freer than others. So one OCM Media, which is headquartered in a different country, in a different Caribbean country, One Caribbean Media, they own businesses in Barbados and Jamaica. In Trinidad, their journalists are freer to report. However, if you have something like Guardian Media Limited, where the businesses are owned in Trinidad, they are not as free to report. So there are different things such as the ownership, the relationship of journalists, as mentioned before, towards each person. Maybe they're related to someone who's in government or as part of these businesses, and also depending on if they get paid more by the individual media house, depending on what their political affiliation is as well, they may or may not report or feel censored. Then looking at using Handitch as well, looking at the role expectations and role executions was a big part of media freedom, the Media Freedom Index, in the creation of looking at a new framework, because journalists that were interviewed, and if we can, just to skip to this slide, can always go back. But journalists that were interviewed, there were 93 journalists interviewed for this study, and 93 tried to get journalists throughout the island, so as many as possible. So it was on average about 20 to 30 per newsroom, plus editors, plus media managers. And there was also an ethnographic study done whereby I was in the newsroom each newsroom for 2 weeks at a time. For these journalists, what many of them said was that they went into the profession wanting to do a great job, wanting to stand up for the people, wanting to share stories and hold power to account. However, because of the situation, they absolutely could not do that. So their role expectation was one thing, and then their role execution was completely different, and that affected their interpretation of their the amount of media freedom they would have as well, because when they went into it, they thought that they would have more freedom to report and do what they wanted, as opposed to the actuality and the reality of the situation. We also looked. I also looked at post-colonial theory and the chilling effects of media laws, just to give you a a glance at the theoretical framework, also because post-colonial theory is relevant in terms of how journalists see their media managers and how they see these private entities that own their media house, and also how they cover the government. Just a quick quote here: there's an unwillingness to devolve authority from a center to the periphery. They're essential features of the operations that will always be there, be part of the culture. They're all pretty authoritarian and canted. There's a direct connection between ownership structures right down to the content. And this is something that, again, in terms of media freedom, if you know you're owned by a certain someone, even the content, either they forbid you from publishing it, or you as a journalist don't bother. And this is just sort of me paraphrasing things from the interviews. So in terms of their media freedom, it is absolutely not, the media freedom is definitely compromised. Some of the questions were: how would you describe level of autonomy? Do you think there's a culture of objectivity? What is journalism culture? And asking them about their ability, their media freedom, if they feel free to cover stories, if they feel free to speak to their editors. What is the impact of media laws as well? Because media laws also formed quite a big part of their inhibitions. However, it was found that journalists were not as worried about media laws as opposed to financial censorship and self-censorship, in terms of sort of this pressure from the media from the owners of the company. So even though these laws would say, you can be in jail for between 2 years or 7 years, depending on the offense, and between 500,000 and 1 million could be the charge, they were not as worried about that. The editors, however, who are the gatekeepers of these stories and who have to okay the stories, etc., they were the ones who were the most worried about the media laws, whereas the actual journalists in day-to-day in their day-to-day jobs were worried more about just self-censorship, and also someone telling them that they could not pursue their stories, which was very interesting, because they did not pay, because they weren't as worried about the media laws, they didn't actually pay much attention to the media laws. And so there are times when actually it did result in them being taken to court or paying a fine as such. So in terms of the index,
just to give you 5-minute warning, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure. So I think let me just do this, and then I'll go to the sort of index. To just drive home what the journalist perspectives in terms of media freedom. There are allegiances where the government tries to influence, sometimes where there's a threat of pulling advertisements, but that's a government's company level. That's not on a journalist level. It trickles down. It can affect the psyche of a journalist, where they're thinking, yeah, I'm on the straight and narrow and I'm pursuing the truth. And then the company pulls a story that you're doing because they get a call. You can't run that. You can't run it. Obviously, you're going to be demotivated. What's the point? CNMG is in no way independent. That is one of the media houses. When we were there, we were good in the beginning, and then the government changed, and then the instructions started coming down that none of us wanted to be a part of. I think that was a credibility hit they never recovered from. There's government interference, which is the reason we all left, because people in government would call the higher up since the PNM came into power, and there are people who are anecdotally understood to be financiers who are maneuvering government image, reputation. And then I think people do get influenced, maybe a situation where somebody gives you something, maybe an opportunity, a situation where you may be, that your contact says, your car isn't working, I'll sort you out. And then they get a car if they don't cover a story. Threats to life, blackmail, what's the point? Although they speak about it, when given the platform, they're saying that the opposition will say, yes, let's solve this, and then they'll cry it down when the shoe's on the other foot, basically. So the point is, just those quotes, that journalists clearly are not free. They don't feel free to report. They self-censor. And we, as the ranking on RSF, which is a ranking that they use in a lot of different meetings and so forth. Not that the ranking is completely erroneous, and by all means RSF is, you know, an amazing entity, and they do amazing work, and these rankings do hold a lot of water. However, there are many other things that need to be taken into control in a new index, which is, you know, looking at the restrictions, the intentions, the historical elements, and the actual newsroom management. Because every country, especially, you can't say, you know, every country every newsroom is different, and the newsroom management is different in the country. So some journalists in some newsrooms will have more freedom, and others won't have as much freedom. So this is why we need to look at these indexes, because if it's sort of, in this respect, it looks as if it's a false index, because then if you're saying that we're ranked number 44 and everything is fine and we have good media freedom, and that's not the case, we're not working on the issues that we should, and we're not putting policy into place that we should to protect journalists and increase media freedom. So it's really important to have this, to basically have this new index, so that we can make better judgments and all around have better media freedom in the country. Thank you.